I've been taking this COVID era, this down to earth and quiet and simple to organized time without distractions and people and less deadlines than before, to really try to dig down into natural law and understand it much better as like a field, as like a label, what is in it, and who are the authors that have been writing big things in it. So just over the last couple of weeks, I've been reading just, like John Locke has been a big one. Been reading about Pufendorf. A lot of people have been saying that Pufendorf has changed Grotius. Grotius is the one I'm going to start on and read his book straight on camera and see how that turns out. But then Pufendorf is known as like the next big author, and I don't know anything about him. And people are claiming he's going to change Grotius's view. John Locke is a big one in that stream of thought, and he's going to be legendary from an American perspective because he's just going to play such a huge role in formulating American founding principles 100 years later. So I've been reading about him. A lot of Roman Catholic criticisms of Locke revolve around how he's taking out teleology and the final cause from human agency. And he's changed natural law also from what it was before. So I've been reading more about that. Something I was reading the other day was how Thomas Jefferson, in his early works, he was not a Roman Catholic at all, but in his early work he was reading a famous Roman Catholic theologian and philosopher, Robert Bellarmine, and somebody online was making the case that proves that America is a crypto-Catholic country because one of its founders was reading a Roman Catholic, and even included some of the citations from Bellarmine in the, what is it called, the Virginia Declaration of Rights or something like an early founding document. So I was like tracing down. It turns out that it's very different from what this person online was claiming, even though obviously Jefferson was citing Bellarmine. But I wanted to understand, who was Bellarmine on this question? What did he say? I've been reading a lot about Grotius. Who is Pufendorf? What did Locke say? Jefferson. And one thing I'll mention in the end, I'm just throwing these names out there. I don't know if it's going to bring value to anybody, but I'm just really interested just to put on wax, as they say. What is it that's going through my head? Last month it was animation and animated platforms. Today it's history, philosophy, theology. That's just how it is with me. Every single few weeks it's like a massive new deep dive into something else. But one thing I'll add is that I'm going to begin with Grotius. And Grotius was, according to some accounts, the reason I'm going to start with him is because according to like the founders, he started a whole new perspective, which later ended up producing a lot of famous thought and results and happy outcomes for humanity. It all began with his work. And of course it led to like America's founding. The project he began in 1625 ended up producing in some ways the English Bill of Rights in 1689, but even more so the American founding way of thinking in 1776. That's all in a huge sense owed to Grotius in 1625. So I want to begin with him as like this new pivotal foundational figure. But according to like the Roman Catholic way of thinking about philosophy and history and all that stuff, Grotius was like a minor blip on the radar, and the real figure that I mean, there's always Thomas Aquinas, who was like in the 1200s. That he's always there in the background for a Roman Catholic interpretation of philosophy. But especially around Grotius' time, there's a guy, famous philosopher, who wrote, a Catholic philosopher. He wrote, they say, twice as much as Thomas Aquinas ever wrote. His name is Francisco Suarez. And in the Catholic interpretation of like the history of America, it's Suarez who laid the foundations for America. You know, Bellarmine and Suarez. And Grotius basically cribbed from Suarez. So Grotius is not anything to even think about. He's just copying Suarez, and Suarez is basically a version of Aquinas. So there's like that tag team of Aquinas in the 1200s, Suarez in the 16th century, as the two pivotal figures. And Grotius is like the blip, but really it's those two that are fueling this way of thinking that then produces the English Bill of Rights and then the American founding documents. And I've been reading a lot about Suarez and exactly what he's said and what he's done. And he, it turns out, was very different from the impression that was created by these accounts online about him. So I've been preparing in my reading, in my study for what I'm going to read about Grotius. I wanted to have some context on Suarez, his contemporary. What did Suarez say? How unique was Grotius, after all? Is he that important in the history of thought, or is he just cribbing from Suarez and from the Roman Catholics? Turns out he is that important, and what makes him so unique and important, Grotius, is what I'll spend a lot of time thinking about and talking about in the Natural Law podcast as it develops. Like why he's not just cribbing from Suarez. In fact, how Suarez is actually not a step forward for philosophy, and he's a step back in a big way. And under his reign as a philosopher, as it were, a lot of like cruelty has been done, a lot of persecution, a lot of mass. Not that he himself condoned. He actually might have condoned mass murder. He didn't like order any mass killings. He was not a politician in any way. But the philosophy he authored, in many ways, was so opposed to what Grotius would go on to talk about liberty and rights and justice. Suarez was so anti most of those concepts that there were massacres that took place that were justified using Suarez's works. And so this propaganda that's being given about the history of thought and the transmission of ideas was completely incorrect, as I discovered. And you know, it's fun to talk about that and to learn about that and read about that now, having read about animation and cartoons and 2D, 3D, vector, raster cartoons before.